commitment to scientism, naturalism's second intellectual commitment. I take scientism to be a species of empiricism, namely the claim that the empirical study of nature provides the most rational, or in stronger versions, the only reliable source of knowledge. I contend that my thought experiment just presented poses a number of problems for scientism. For instance, how does one empirically analyze abstract propositions and laws of logic? By the way, there was a significant effort to do so back in the early 1900s, but with not much success. But let me suggest that scientism has even a more profound problem. You see, scientism, like other versions of empiricism, are heavily dependent on the assumption that we are cognitive subjects who have cognitive empirical access to reality that is truth-conducive. But how can one show this assumption to be accurate and true without appealing to our empirical experiences? Which only begs the question. That is to say that it engages in a vicious form of circular reasoning. This has been a point that has been greatly exploited by skeptics, and particularly by those who identify themselves as postmodern. And while I find myself on the same side of the issue as empiricists, the bottom line is that we have to trust our sense perceptions as being generally reliable and veridical, thus giving us a truthful perspective of reality, including the natural world. Otherwise, even science is unable to give us knowledge of the external world. Now notice I said trust, which leads us back to the point of faith commitments. Finally, ethical naturalism is the basis for ethics. I think it's important to clarify my claim here. The issue in regards to ethics is not, and I emphasize is not, whether secularist or moral or not. In fact, my argument here relies on the point that secularists do seek to be morally virtuous people. What is relevant? What is relevant here to my specific argument is whether naturalism can provide an adequate basis for normative morality. In other words, that naturalism can give us some basis for what counts as moral and immoral. Time prevents me from making a full argument here, so I will be brief. It seems to me that ethical naturalism has to resort to one of three options, providing a normative ethic that guides one's moral attitudes and actions: self, society, or nature. To appeal to self as normative seems both logically inconsistent and morally problematic, in that moral subjectivism, or even ethical egoism, makes it difficult to offer any ethical norms, and further that it fails to address social moral problems like injustice. Likewise, to appeal to society as the basis for morality usually results in some version of conventionalism that allows for the Nazi Holocaust, slavery, and disallows for moral reformation like the Civil Rights Movement. So most moral philosophers who are of the naturalist persuasion seem to favor a socio-biological approach, with evolutionary ethics being the most recent attempt to find a naturalist basis for morality. But as Michael Ruse, philosopher of science and proponent of evolutionary ethics, admits, quote, "What I believe is that claims of normative ethics are like the rules of a game. In baseball, it is true that after 3 strikes, the batter is out. But this claim does not have any reference or correspondence in absolute reality. What right have I to say, as an evolutionist, that normative ethics has no foundation? I've argued that normative ethics is a biological adaptation, and I would argue that as such, it can be seen to have no being or reality beyond this. We believe normative ethics for our own biological good, and that is that." End of quote. Ruse's point about moral goods being biological adaptations is further enhanced by philosopher Patricia Churchland, who summarizes our biological needs as, quote, "Boiled down to the essentials, a nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. The principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive." End of quote. She then later concludes, "Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindermost." End of quote. This last statement by Churchland brings us to a full circle in terms of my argument. The secular perspective, be it an atheist, agnostic, or whatever, relies on intellectual commitment to naturalism, which is neither self-evident nor rationally decisive. Given my definition of generic faith, Naturalism, in terms of its metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical commitments, can be seen as clearly exemplifying such a faith, and thus enjoys no privileged rational status over religious belief. In fact, given some of the considerations raised in my argument, one could make the case that naturalism is actually rationally inferior to a thoughtful version of theism. But that's for another time. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Martin Erwig. Dr. Erwig is professor of computer science at Oregon State University. He's been teaching there since the year 2000. He received his PhD and habilitation in computer science from the University of Hagen in Germany. He's the author or co-author of 2 books and over 90 peer-reviewed publications, for which he has received several Best Paper Awards. His research interests are in language design, functional programming, and visual languages. Please join me in welcoming Martin Erwig.
All right, so thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this debate. And I think I just used it. All right, let me try this. This one? Yes. All right. So maybe I should first start off by saying that what I'm saying here tonight are my personal opinions and do not in any way represent the opinions of Oregon State University. So I want to start out with a news item that many of you probably have seen, and I will explain later why this is relevant. So less than a month ago, the Vatican came out with a claim that Bart and Homer Simpson are Catholic. Well, that was an interesting claim, and they have some reasons why they say this. And then I did some digging around, and I found, for example, this claim. And Homer says to Liza, if the Bible has taught us nothing else, and it hasn't, it's that girls should stick to girl sports such as hot oil wrestling, foxy boxing, and such and such. And well, while I can see that this certainly supports the attitude of the Catholic Church toward women, it's probably not what they had in mind. And so our conclusion here for this claim would be what? No, right, exactly. So now, why is this relevant? Why is it relevant? There are 2 things that this story tells us. First of all, it tells us something about the relationship between theology and science, and it also tells us something about an argumentative trick that I think Mike has tried to avoid, but he did it nevertheless. So, first of all, theology and science. So, first of all, what is the role of evidence in theology? Well, it's at most marginal, right? So, whenever it fits your message, evidence is fine. Otherwise, it's conveniently ignored. Whereas in science, evidence is pivotal. It is really the absolutely necessary, and it is used to confirm conjectures and also to reject hypotheses. And the second point is, well, what is the object of interest of theology and science? Well, remember this, the story is about the faith of 2 cartoon characters, right? They don't even exist. So whereas science deals with reality, theology, I skipped that, deals more with fiction. All right, so the other thing is the argumentation trick that is involved here. And so why did the Vatican newspaper bring this story? Well, I think the argument goes like this. Well, if the Simpsons are Catholic, so kids could say, well then it's cool to be Catholic. So it's really a modern thing to be. And so the argument that Mike has presented, and that is behind the question tonight, is actually very similar. It is, if even atheists who claim to reject faith altogether actually do have faith, well then faith is unavoidable and okay, and it's a rational basis for our beliefs in a God, for example. And also the consequence here that the faith rejection of atheists is really hypocritical. And so my argument outline is this. First of all, in order to answer the question of our debate tonight, I first have to say a little bit about what an atheist is, and then I have to talk about what having faith really means. So I have to take issue a little bit with Mike's definition, and I fear that this will be the case, but I think it's unavoidable. And then finally, I have to present my conclusion. Actually, I have to do a little bit more. I also want to talk a little bit about why this question really matters. And I also have to talk about the nature of religious faith. So, what is an atheist? As you can see, an atheist is really somebody, atheists do not really have an agenda, okay? It's really philosophically not, it's not really a philosophical position. There's no specific ethics involved in being an atheist. We have Democrats being atheists and Republicans, you have vegetarians, I mean everybody, this is really not a philosophical position. What atheists do share, however, is that they do not believe in the existence of a supernatural being. And it's very important to understand how atheists come to this conclusion. It's not really something you start out with, it's really the conclusion of a thought process. And so in this respect, I would actually accept Mike's definition of, or Mike's extension of the notion of atheists to secularists and people who base their reasoning on science. And what I think is common to all atheists is that they form their beliefs based on observations and experience. And in particular, they base, their worldview is strongly based on the scientific method. They really embrace the scientific method, and they make observations, and they don't find any evidence for God, and so then they conclude there is no God. Okay, so this is very important. Atheism is not a premise, it is a conclusion. So why does this question, whether or not atheists have faith, really matter? Well, first of all, if we agree to this, it will provide a free pass for theists. If everybody has faith in something, then it's fine to have faith in God. Okay? So, so we can't let them off the hook that easily. But the second and more important reason is that faith is extremely dangerous. So, in particular, the attitude that faith is compatible or comparable to science in finding the truth, that actually weakens our concept of truth, and it gives religion an undeserved authority. And then oftentimes faith is of course used to defend many bad ideas, racism, misogyny, and so on and so forth. And the essence of religious faith is this: it is very subjective and unreliable. It's an unreliable method to gain any truth. Since it is subjective, it supports contradictory claims. And by its very nature, it's immune to revisions by facts and observations. And so, by that, it is an impediment to further inquiry. Yet, well, faith is considered to be a virtue by a religion. Now, let me talk also about some features of religious faith. First of all, faith deludes individuals. And well, I'll give you only one example, namely the victims of faith healing. You see here, little Harrison, he died of a bee sting because his parents refused medical treatment and prayed for his recovery. Or Amy, or